Yeah.
So did you have ancestors who were pirates?
Yes, I had a very second-rate pirate in my family, a man called Phineas Bunch, and my father asked me, my father retired about to hit 80, and he was decided he wanted to do a bit of research into the family, and he asked me if I could start digging around the records, which he couldn't get to because he was in London, I was in New York, different sets of records, and could I find anything out about this man called Phineas Bunch. So we were both, doing this together, him on his end, me on my end, and it was a very short story. He was a salt raker who, used to work in the Caribbean and turned to pirate when he was sort of 17, and by the time he hit 19, he was dead at the end of a rope. But his path crossed with this other story, which was absolutely fascinating, which was the story of Bartholomew Roberts, who was the sort of greatest of all of the pirates of the Golden Age, who captured or sank over 500 ships,
Really?
put together a crew of over 500 men. I mean, it was a very professional outfit run around democratic principles in the 18th century, of which there just really weren't any. I mean, yes, it really was a very bloody and brutal time, but at the same time, all these men had come out of the British Navy. The Treaty of Utrecht had been signed in Europe in 1713, so the British Navy, in its goodness, didn't even ship them back to the British Isles. They just cut them loose wherever they were and told them to look after themselves. And there was, you can imagine, it was a 100% unemployment rate, and piracy was a reasonably easy answer.
Were these largely men who'd been impressed into the Navy in the first place?
Impressed or not impressed, but either way they were in there. Yeah. So, but his story goes everywhere from southern Brazil across up all the way north to Newfoundland, and then all the way back to Africa, and that was sort of his triangular.
But that was the century of the big triangular trade, wasn't it? Where it was slaves and sugar or rum and.
Yeah. But Newfoundland, I think, was his own invention. He was up there preying on the sort of summer fishing communities. But yeah, other than that, he pretty much followed a more standard route.
So how did this inspire you into a novel?
The story was just so wonderful. I mean, and I think also having had these problems writing my first book and having to finish it, I wrote myself into a corner. The wonderful thing about turning to historical fiction was that the skeleton of the story was already there for me, and I had a lot of fun changing it all. I mean, when I first handed that book in, I think it was 800-900 pages long, and my editor looked at it and was in absolute horror, and began to explain to me, as the rookie that I was, that really, can have all the respect for history that you want, but have some respect for the story as well. So we started cutting things down, and things that were perhaps historically accurate were also extraneous, and we started chopping away, and sure enough, it ended up at a very manageable sort of 350 pages.
Narrative drive is the key to successful
Narrative
fiction.
drive, there you go.
Were you tempted to do something like an author note at the end in order to use up all that lovely history?
I did something even more criminal, so to speak, in my first draft, which was I had the whole thing annotated in footnotes, which was a sure way to drive any reader insane. So we got rid of those as well, and I was just told to let go of all that. I'd done 3 or 4 years of research before the book was finished, and I was just told to let go of it all.
I think Umberto Eco with The Name of the Rose might have been the last major fiction that was footnoted.
It was,
and I do have to say that I thought it was unreadable until I forced myself not to read the footnotes, because it interrupted the story so desperately that you would get jogged off it, the track, and then it was hard to pick it back up again.
Yeah.
So the better way to do it was to read the narrative, and then if you wanted to go back to the footnotes. But that's why I think an author note is a great answer. I've had some of the writers that I edit who write historical fiction, or, for example, we're publishing a novel, a 4th novel set in Baroque Italy, your century there, the 18th century, and it's a country house murder set in the Veneto. It's called The Iron Tongue of Midnight, and it's basically kind of a commissioned opera company putting on a performance by socially pretentious people who want all the neighbors to come in and be deeply impressed. And the Veneto, and the murder goes on. Where was I going with this?
The author note.
Oh, footnotes, thank you. And one of the characters, I'm getting really old, I'm sorry. One of the main characters suffers from what we know today as Tourette's syndrome and takes copious quantities of her elixir, quote, you know, to kind of deal with that. And you can't, in the context of this 18th century story, either discuss Tourette's and what it is, or discuss laudanum and you know, the desperate addiction, in fact, that this poor person has developed to the drug. So the only way to really manage that was to do an author footnote at the end. And I have found that reviewers and readers very often are more interested in the footnotes. I mean, it's a separate thing, not that they reject the story, but really devour the author note section or the historical section.
I mean, my new book has an author note in it, and I think it is that key part where you're like, oh, he was he was telling the truth about that, or that historical.
Well, you can either reference your sources, or you can explain something that the people in the story at the time couldn't really know, or you know, explain how you moved history around to fit your narrative. You know, I never care about that one. There are a lot of apologies from authors about, you know, it really happened in month X, but to make my story work, it needed, and I always think, who cares? You know, it's really not that essential. But when you're talking about something like a disease that can't be comprehended then, but can now, or you've got a lot of stuff about shell shock, for example, in Dizzy City. I thought one of the great things about your character is that he's clearly suffering a dramatic case of shell shock from the trench warfare, but nobody knows what it is.
Yeah, but I mean, the difference, the easier thing for me than for your writer is that nowadays we do all know post-traumatic stress disorder and shell shock, so we
kind of infer it.
The inference is there. Tourette's, I'm not sure.
It's not as widely known. Sue Grafton used it in one of her books. I think it might have been J is for Judgment, and it's been in one or two other things. But it's an embarrassing disorder, you know, because people are prone to outbursts of profanity and other things. So it's a tough disorder to cope with all the way around. But anyway, so Pirates. There you were. How did it do? Requiem Shark?
Did really well for me. I mean, it was just. You know, of course, you then wish it had come out at the same time as Johnny Depp and his Pirates, but you know, it's sort of.
Yeah, you were kind of ahead of the curve.
Yeah, I was just a little ahead of the curve on that one. But no, I mean, I think, maybe not a nice thing to say, but it happened to coincide with the death of Patrick O'Brian, who's one of my favorite authors. A lot of all these wonderful novels of 19th century.
The Aubrey and Maturin saga. Yeah,
exactly, and his. I think I got picked up by a lot of his readers looking for the sort of the dark side of those sorts of stories, and I think there's a faithful following in C's stories that seem to embrace me. I'm afraid I didn't go back and write another one yet.
Well, if it's out of print, have you considered, you know, have you recovered the rights so that perhaps the book could reissue? It's
still in print in England, and I'm looking to recover the rights for that one.
I mean, it seems to me the timing, you know, today would be very good to bring it out again. And there's a wave. I was looking this month alone. There's about 6 epic sea stories, one sort or another, coming out by various authors. One's a Canadian, lives in Vancouver. He's got a big book for Putnam. His name is Russell, and I can't remember the name. Enemy, maybe it's under Enemy Color, or under the Enemy flag or something. But there's a constant grade of people since O'Brian, contiguously with O'Brian. Bernard Cornwell, you know, no, actually his has been The Rifleman. He's done, I don't think he's done C, but Forrester had done C, the Hornblower things, and been a fair history of authors who've, I think it's the whole Napoleonic War I'm thinking about, because Cornwell's guy is in the Peninsular Wars in Portugal.
Wow. No, well, this Requiem Shark was back in the early part of the 18th century, when things were a little looser with the British Navy, although dominant wasn't quite as dominant, so there was plenty of space for pirates to find their ways around the Caribbean without interruption.
So from Requiem Shark, was your next published book The House of Light and Shadow?
The House of Sight and Shadow, yeah.
Sight and Shadow. Why do I always call it light? Sorry.
Don't worry, my mother calls it the same thing.
Just whatever.